Many have heard about Egyptologist David Falk's very harsh and inappropriate words describing British professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou's scholarly work on the Bible and media appearances. Dr. Daniel McClellan, who I interviewed here, responded to what Falk said, which really made people aware of this whole mess. A petition with around 100 signatures from scholars all over the world was sent to Vancouver School of Theology, where Dr. Falk and his wife were both research associates. Since then, the school has cut ties with both of them. Well, recently, an unlikely atheist YouTuber, otherwise known as Pine Creek, has spoken publicly on the topic, defending why he doesn't think it's right to assume that Dr. David Falk is a misogynist. While I find Falk's initial comments to be shocking and unprofessional, I found the arguments for why we shouldn't label Dr. Falk as a misogynist to be convincing, so I thought this would be a good idea to talk about those. In addition, one particular scholar has reached out to me privately on why he thinks there has been a misrepresentation of scholarly consensus on a subtopic of this discussion, so my scholar friend has encouraged me to share some thoughts as well. Finally, I admit that it's possible that I might not be understanding the situation well, or even worse, that I might be unaware that I'm actually a misogynist myself. If you think either of those could be the case, please write in the comments as nicely as possible why you think that is so. If you can help me understand why that is true, I will be happy to correct or even take this video down. We will first talk about what it takes to determine if someone is a misogynist. We will then watch and dissect Dr. Falk's words to hopefully determine if his words and actions are enough to show he is a misogynist. And finally, we will discuss the level of correctness in Dr. Falk's analysis of Dr. Stavrakopoulou's biblical scholarship. Now, in order to determine whether Dr. Falk is a misogynist, we need to first figure out what that means. Merriam-Webster Dictionary describes it as hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against women. I think what most people are concerned about in this situation is if Dr. Falk's poor analysis of Dr. Stavrakopoulou is due to either consciously or subconsciously thinking that Stavrakopoulou's scholarship is bad and weird entirely or partially based on her being a woman. If this is true, this definition of having a prejudice against women would definitely apply to him. That gets into my next distinction, which is that I see two ways that one can be a misogynist. It can be either conscious or subconscious. Something like this is rarely a conscious thing because most people realize the idiocy of someone thinking that their intelligence is less purely based on their sex. Considering Dr. Falk has a PhD from a very prestigious school, it's doubtful Dr. Falk would be so unintelligent to consciously think that women have less of an ability to make rational arguments. He's around women scholars all the time. Surely he's found some that have had good arguments. At the same time, decisions are often made by past experiences, which can develop into subconscious habits, which can negatively influence how we treat people even if we aren't consciously aware of why we do it. An obvious example is how a child might have a father who treats his wife poorly. If you're exposed to women getting treated poorly as a child, you may grow up thinking this is how you're expected to treat women. In this type of family structure, you're basically taught this is what you're supposed to do. I think it's safe to assume that most of these people aren't asking themselves why they treat women differently. Most of them probably don't even notice a difference in how they treat women or men. This will be important to remember for when we look at what Dr. Falk has said on how he feels about women in scholarship. Okay, so we know what misogyny is, but what do we need to conclude that Dr. Falk is a misogynist? Well, we shouldn't be looking for certainty. We can't read people's minds, obviously. We're looking for what's the most likely reason or reasons for why Dr. Falk acted like this. So, how do we find what is the most likely reason? Well, that's difficult. Human psychology is extremely complicated. People do and say weird things for all kinds of different reasons. It's not enough to say that Dr. Falk is a jerk, as if that gets him off the hook, as he can obviously be both a misogynist and a jerk at the same time. In order to conclude Dr. Falk is probably a misogynist, we must identify what are the most likely possible reasons for why Falk would have said what he said, and then compare them to see what is the best explanation among them. An obvious way to determine if he's a misogynist is for him to say something only a misogynist would say, like, I think all women do bad scholarship specifically because they are women. Assuming he's not lying, that'd be a great reason to think he's a misogynist, but it's doubtful we would hear anyone ever say that for the reasons stated previously. At the same time, even if we did hear those exact words, it's still possible, while unlikely, that someone could misspeak when they say, I think all women do bad scholarship specifically because they are women. At the same time, even if we did hear those exact words, it's still possible, while unlikely, that someone could misspeak when they say, I think all women do bad scholarship specifically because they are women. People misspeak all the time, and that's a fact. I can think of a number of different situations where even the most obvious way to say one is a misogynist, that it's still possible that they aren't. Another is that one can be saying things just for attention. No, I'm not saying that he could have possibly misspoke or lied, or just wants attention, and therefore that's what he did. If someone came out and said, I think women are bad scholars because they're women, I think we should conclude that person's a misogynist. What I'm saying is that we have to be honest with ourselves that even with the most obvious things someone could say, it's almost impossible to get close to absolute certainty. So if we still don't have absolute confidence when we're talking about some of the best evidence we could have, think of how careful we should be when it's not as obvious, when there are unclear things said. Okay, thanks for bearing with me as we talk about methodology. Let's now get into what Dr. Falk actually said. Just for background context, this was part of one of his live streams he does where he talks for 3 or 4 straight hours. People ask him all kinds of questions and he doesn't specifically prepare for them. I also will be including parts of Dr. Daniel McClellan's comments in here as they add some needed context. We're going to watch it fully through and then break it down.
Hello, Andres for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. He says, great refutation, Theologica. What are your thoughts on Francesca Stavrakopoulou's work? Okay. Now that would be difficult to pronounce if you didn't know how to do it. Stavrakopoulou she's fringe. Okay, she's out there. You know, she thinks that, for example, redemption of the firstborn in the Torah is child sacrifice. She thinks God had a body in the ancient Near East. Okay, well, you know, I can see where she could get that idea, but it's still kind of odd. She has some very, very weird ideas. So I don't have a high opinion of her work. I never have had a high opinion of her work. I think it's there's just some stuff that she does, especially that child sacrificing. I think that's just crazy. All right. And the whole purpose of the redemption fee is so you don't sacrifice your kids. So the idea that it means really sacrifice is sort of flipping the meaning of the text on its head.
Okay, so far, Falk has said her name wrong, which may give the impression that he hasn't made the effort to understand her work well enough to even get her name right. Kind of awkward. He said she's fringe and out there. The only critique he gave of her work specifically was actually a misrepresentation of her work, which seems like another instance where it could be him not making the effort to understand her before critiquing. I think if we stopped right here, most people probably wouldn't think much of what he said. You know, it's a live stream. He's probably going entirely off of memory. Obviously, people and professionals specifically shouldn't be giving critiques of people's work without understanding, but I think we all realize that nobody's perfect and we don't always have a perfect memory. So one explanation is that he knew a position and forgot it. Another is that he didn't put the effort in to ever learn to begin with, but instead critiqued it without even understanding. It gets worse though. But before we listen more, I just want to point out that some of her views are most certainly weird. Weird to at least conservative scholars. She thinks Isaiah 6, 1 to 5 refers to God having a male testicle that fills God's temple. Maybe Falk didn't know about this, maybe he didn't, just didn't mention it, but that is certainly a weird view according to most people familiar with the Bible out there, or God. It might be right, it might not be, but it's definitely weird. So, anyways, let's keep going.
So I don't care for her work. I don't care for her work in the slightest. But I also think she's kind of a waste of time too. She's window dressing. She's theological window dressing. She's basically attractive, and that's why she's always featured on, say, BBC shows. It's because she's one of the few theologians that doesn't look like an old gray man who's dusty around the ears.
He said a lot here, so I want to pause. So Dr. Falk ends basically a critique of her work about the ideas she presents, and then starts a bit of a different discussion by saying she's kind of a waste of time, which by itself sounds extremely mean to say of a person. He doesn't say her work is a waste of time. He says she's kind of a waste of time. He then says she's window dressing. She's basically attractive. So far, he's incorrectly summed up one view of her work, has been really harsh, and now starts talking about her looks, which is something of a cultural taboo where you don't comment on people's looks in an academic discussion. It strongly gives the impression that he doesn't like her scholarly work because of her looks. Then he says that her being attractive is why people want her on TV. At this point, one possibility is that he started this part by saying she's attractive and then made the connection while talking about her level of attractiveness that she must be on TV because she's attractive. This would obviously be morally disgusting, as it essentially means he is not only critiquing her work, but framing it as if her only value as a person is in her looks. It's completely demeaning if true. I don't think it is, though. One reason I think that is because he doesn't show anything on his face as if he's coming to the conclusion while talking. There's no, oh, that makes sense, look on his face. In addition, I wanted to mention that when he says she's kind of a waste of time, it doesn't seem, to me at least, maybe someone can comment in the comments, point me to something different, but it doesn't seem to me to make sense in this context to be thinking that he's trying to just completely demean her, as in like she has no value or something like that as a person. And we're talking about in the context of, what do you think of her as a scholar? Now, I realize that you might ask, okay, why would they be talking about, the physical as well as, she's kind of a waste of time? Well, it seems to me that when we're talking about the flow of discussion, we're talking about, all right, he attempted at least to criticize her scholarly work, and then we're moving on, as we will get into why he thinks she's on TV. Maybe someone could say it in the comments, but it seems to me that he's not necessarily saying that he thinks she has no value as a person or, just a human, but we're talking about the context of his views of her academic work, which would include her specific views, as well as what we'll talk about, which is her viewing on TV. And so when he says she's kind of a waste of time, he means she's a waste of time to look at her work or, watch her videos and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, another more probable explanation for why he framed it like this is because he was giving us the justification for why she's on TV, before he actually tells us that she is on TV. Normally, I'd say this was silly, but for anyone who's watched Falk streams before, you'll know that his mannerisms for how he communicates are different than most people. For example, he does this thing where he makes a point, pauses for dramatic effect, or maybe because he's thinking, I don't know exactly why he does it, and then he makes another point. This, of course, is awkward when you're interviewing him because you think he's done with his point, so you go in to comment, but he's not done, so you end up talking over each other. But anyways, under this hypothesis, it was almost like Falk was talking about how he didn't like her scholarship, and then he imagined someone asking, oh, so why is she famous then if her views aren't very good? To which he says she's window dressing. She's basically attractive. That's why she's always featured on BBC shows. Another reason I think this looks worse than it should be is because he says it in a way where if you take him completely literally, it sounds like he's saying that her attractiveness is the only reason she's on TV. I think on face value, that's kind of ridiculous once we stop and think about it. If he thought she was only on there for looks, he wouldn't compare her to a Bible scholar who's a dusty old man. No, he didn't explicitly say that there are other reasons, but obviously there are other reasons. These Bible documentary shows wouldn't want her at all if she wasn't a Bible scholar. If I think we are honest with ourselves, we should be able to clearly see the point he's making here. He's saying that the reason she's famous and on TV is because she's a Bible scholar that's attractive, which really shouldn't be that crazy, as we know that from countless psychological and statistical studies that attractive people typically do better in life. I don't think anyone debates that, obviously.
That's going to get you an audience. Not to be crass about this, but when you start doing theology by cup size, that's a bad start. And it's really clear that that's what they're doing with this. So, and she plays it too. She plays it too. You know, it's not like she isn't doing this.
Next, he says, once you start doing theology by cup size, it's a bad start. This is obviously a ridiculously inappropriate way to make an argument. I laughed at this when I first heard it because it is so way out of my vocabulary that I would never even think to say something like that because it is just so against how we should communicate in scholarly discussions like this. Now, even though nobody should ever be saying something like that in a discussion like this, it's still important to ask what exactly he meant because it's actually not that clear. He said, once you start doing theology by cup size, it's a bad start. The question in this situation is, who's the you? Of course, this is in the context of him talking about why she's on TV, so he's either talking about people in general, Francesca, or the TV people that he thinks want her for her looks. And Dr. Daniel McClellan's response to Dr. Falk, the one that really started all of this, he assumed that the you was Dr. Stavrokopoulou that Dr. Falk was referring to, and therefore said,
saying that she's doing theology by cup size is abhorrent and misogynistic, and this is absolutely pathetic.
But let's think about it, though. Like, why would we think Falk was thinking that she was doing theology by cup size? How does one even do that? That's not even possible. As if the size of part of her body would affect her ability to think rationally. That's kind of ridiculous. Now, maybe you think Falk is misogynistic and a jerk and whatever else, which isn't a completely ludicrous position to take, and therefore him saying she's doing theology by cup size would be actually expected of him. But the question I would urge you to ask yourself is if you think he's so stupid that he would think that someone can make theological arguments based on the size of a part of their body. Personally, I think that's kind of silly to think someone with a PhD in Egyptology from Liverpool would be so confused about life to think that is even possible. I think a little more plausible position to take would be to think that he was referring to her, but when he said theology by cup size, he meant that metaphorically, as in she makes her arguments based on her gender, but is that really even possible either? As I noted before, one reason he doesn't like her view is because he didn't think it was reasonable for the Israelites to make up a law about child sacrifice in order to fix a law about child sacrifice. Okay, so how does that have anything to do with being a woman? I mean, I could see how this might maybe make sense if he didn't like it because her argument had something to do with being a woman, but this is a discussion that has nothing to do with being a woman. I would encourage you to consider another option, which is that he was referring to the TV companies that are doing theology by cup size. This makes a lot more sense and wouldn't require someone with a PhD from Liverpool to be saying something that's completely idiotic. The second half of the discussion hasn't had much to do with his critique of her scholarship or doing theology, but instead of about her level of attractiveness and its impact on people wanting her on TV. So what would it mean for a TV channel to be doing theology by cup size? Well, that would seem to mean what he was already saying, which is that organizations like the BBC are choosing to put her on there, therefore choosing a scholar based on her looks, and thereby choosing to do a particular theology based on the theology that comes along with her. This seems to me what he very obviously meant when you take into account the sentences before and after what he said. But me being the amateur journalist that I am, I figured I would just ask Dr. Falk who the you was. I said, "Hello, Dr. Falk. I've decided to make a video commenting on the misogyny and scholarship claims. Can you clarify who the you is when you said, when you start doing theology by cup size, that's a bad start?" He responded by saying, the you was referring to the media in general, but specifically the BBC and to some extent Stavrokopoulou, who leverages upon that. As you can see, that was a bit of an unexpected response for me. It appears that the you referred to both the people and her. Kind of. Assuming you think he's being honest, it confirms that he was trying to say that the you referred to the BBC TV people. At the same time, he said, and to some extent, Stavrokopoulou, who leverages upon that. Well, I mean, that's obviously not the same as what I said she was probably not, but possibly thinking when I was thinking that maybe she was basing her arguments off her gender. At the same time, that still might be a little vague. I needed to confirm that it wasn't that he thought her gender was influencing her work. I said, okay, just to be abundantly clear, when you said, when you start doing theology by cup size, that's a bad start, you were not implying that the shape of Francesca's body was affecting her scholarship in a negative way. He said, no, absolutely not. I disagree with her scholarship, but I don't think her body has any relation to that. I was referring to the added exposure that her message gets in the media because of her pleasant appearance. Now, once again, assuming that he's being honest, this completely contradicts what Dr. McCllelan said when he assumed that Falk was implying that he thought her gender was affecting her theology. Now, what I would like is for someone to explain to me how it is misogynistic for Falk to say that Stavrokopoulou leverages upon her looks. Like, why would she not? I sure would leverage my looks if it got me more popular. Falk isn't done, though.
So, again, I think her work is atrocious. I think how she presents herself is not as a serious scholar. And she's really on the periphery of, say, liberal theology.
So that's the last part, but he really doesn't say much more that's worth commenting on there. He also gave an apology on a YouTube community post afterwards where he admitted that his comment was rude and inflammatory. He even said that it could have been taken the wrong way, which implies that he wasn't as clear as he should have been, and that's why everyone is so upset about what he said. He then reiterated what he said when I asked him directly, which is that he was never implying her work is bad because she's a woman. Of course, some people didn't like his apology because it seemed like he was not apologizing for, the misogynistic things he said. But of course, he doesn't think that he said misogynistic things. He's obviously not going to apologize for saying misogynistic things when he didn't think that he said anything misogynistic. If he was just misunderstood, then an apology for saying things rude and not being clear should be enough, in my opinion. So to sum up, I'm going to remind you of everything Falk said that was remotely close to being misogynistic or mean. Dr. David Falk mispronounced her name. He misrepresented her views. He said that they were weird, that they were French. She's out there. Her view is odd. She's not worth the time. She's theological window dressing. She's basically attractive. When you start doing theology by cup size, that's a bad start. She represents herself as not a serious scholar, and she's a liberal scholar. What of what he said is explicitly misogynistic? The only thing that is close to that is in regard to his comments about cup size, and he explicitly denied that is what he meant. Now, I can see how one would still say that him being misogynistic would be a reason for him not taking her scholarship seriously or being rude. But I think it's ridiculous to think that he said anything which made it explicitly clear that he dislikes her scholarship because she's a woman. If true, that rules out the first way I said one can be a misogynist, which is one that consciously knows it. The other way I mentioned was that misogyny could be subconscious, but if you want to say that, you have to show what specifically he said that can't be better explained by some other combination of ignorance, jealousy, just a rude personality, or carelessness. What about what he said couldn't be explained by him actually just thinking her views are really bad because he doesn't understand her view, and because he genuinely thinks she gets attention because of her looks? I mean, if you misunderstand a person's view and you make it seem as if it's really bad, or your understanding of it is very bad and it sounds stupid, and then you say, oh, it's a stupid view, like, why shouldn't we expect that? Could he not say practically the exact same thing about a man? If one could say the same about a man, you admit that it's possible that he said something that isn't misogynistic at all. So you admit that there are other possibilities. What is your argument for why he must be misogynistic? I would love to see in the comments. Okay, let's take a look at what atheist Pine Creek said about this whole ordeal. He says, this is a case where there is academic disagreement, which Dr. Stavrokopoulou has no problem, and where one man's opinion about one woman's beauty plays a role in TV appearances, which Dr. Stavrokopoulou admits TV is about visuals and that she has a nice smile and is good at her job. In my opinion, ignorance of academic work, jealousy of academic exposure, and just pure taste in wording is a better explanation than accusations of misogyny. But people like to be outraged and signal their virtue. Now, I certainly wouldn't go as far to say that everyone likes to be outraged and everyone likes to signal virtue. I'm sure Pine Creek wouldn't say that literally everyone is like that either. Well said, Pine Creek. In addition, I wanted to mention Dr. McClellan's comments about what Dr. Falk said about Dr. Stavropoulou's views and how they are fringe. McClellan responded by saying not only are they not fringe, but they are consensus. I have no reason to doubt that there are a lot of scholars that think the Israelites thought God had a material body. The scholars I've spoken with have only affirmed that, but I don't know of any experts on the topic to know for certain, in my opinion. On the other hand, I actually had an Old Testament scholar reach out to me about the Exodus passage being about child sacrifice. While Stavropoulou's view is certainly not fringe, there most certainly is not a consensus view. I won't read through all of it, but here's a bunch of quotes from different scholars if interested. On the Passover ritual related to Exodus 22:29, there is neither scholarly consensus on the historical context of these rituals and reinterpretations, nor a less disparate, I don't know how to pronounce that, situation of exegetical scholarship to allow for any clarity about the stages and the historical context of the narrative itself. Here's one more in depth, and this is from my scholar friend. All that to say, there is no consensus here. There is a group of scholars who think the early child sacrifice interpretation is more convincing than other hypotheses. However, a lot of scholars do not find that convincing. I'd also encourage you to check out this paper right here, which I and my scholar friend would argue thoroughly shows that the Ezekiel passage is not referring to the supposed child sacrifice practice in Exodus. Okay, so before we go, let's talk about possible objections. Possible objection number 1 found on Pine Creek's video comment section. This person says, rather than engage with her case, he talks about her appearance. Would he do the same to Dr. Josh Bowen? Rather than discuss his points, would he mention Dr. Bowen's dreamy blue eyes? I wonder. I could be wrong, but this seems to imply that Dr. Falk is only talking about her appearance because she's a woman, and wouldn't if he were critiquing another attractive man. Considering he would probably show partiality between genders, Falk must be a misogynist. As much as I love Dr. Joshua Bowen's dreamy blue eyes, I don't find this very convincing for a number of reasons. Falk did make some kind of attempt to engage with her case regarding the child sacrifice issue. Sure, he didn't represent it well and maybe critiqued a straw man, but there are a number of different reasons for which could explain why he would strawman that don't necessarily imply that he's a misogynist. In addition, I think it's ridiculous to expect him to fully articulate her views in that setting. Pine Creek says it well in a response to this comment. As a content creator myself, for someone to suggest that I must take that moment right there, right now, to explain all the reasons why I disagree with someone is crazy. The reason why he talked about her appearance is because she appears on TV a lot, and he's trying to reconcile how a person who is so wrong can be so popular and uses her looks, which is a reasonable explanation in many cases. End quote. So why would he not mention Dr. Bowen's dreamy blue eyes? Because to my knowledge, Bowen isn't getting interviewed for the BBC at all. On another note, another commenter said, I wonder how they could reconcile their popularity if the person was a man instead of a woman. I doubt he'd bring up looks. End quote. To which I would argue that being an attractive woman on a show primarily watched by men has a lot higher probability to grab the attention of their audience than an attractive man on their show. Now, I could be wrong, but if you look in the entire realm of scholarship, there are a lot more men doing scholarship than women. That is one reason to have a woman on. Another reason is because an attractive woman on a show, which, I think there's a good chance that most people watching these shows are primarily men. I think that has a lot higher probability to grab the attention of the audience rather than a man. Possible objection number 2. He explicitly mentioned her gender as a way to bring her down. And of course, my response is, how do you know he was intending to bring her down because of her gender? And how would that equal misogyny? If you say that's misogyny, every time someone says something bad about someone specifically based on being a woman must be misogyny as well. That sounds ridiculous. Is it misogynistic to say that women's basketball is not as exciting as men's? Not inherently. It's a fact of nature that men are most often more physically equipped for a sport like basketball. They do more exciting things like dunk a basketball, something which only 7 women in the history of the entire WNBA have done. Likewise, it's certainly a fact that Dr. Stavrokopoulou has gotten some extra attention because she's an attractive woman. Does him saying it in a crude term change the meaning of what he said? An even better question, would anyone have even cared what he said if he said people were theologizing by hair length? Possible objection number 3. TV companies like the BBC have dusty old grey on there all the time because they have good scholarship. This shows that they aren't concerned about just looks, and they might even not care about looks at all. I agree. I think there are additional reasons why Dr. Stavrokopoulou would be popular other than her being a scholar and having good looks. But that's besides the point. Even if true that looks don't come into play at all that means is Falk is not using critical thinking when coming to this conclusion. You have to give evidence for why his lack of critical thinking is due to his misogyny compared to the many other possible reasons why he comes to his conclusions. You can't just point at words and say, that's misogyny, without explaining why you think it's specifically misogyny compared to other views. Anyways, I've given reasons to doubt whether Falk is a misogynist. He might be a lot of other bad things, which I don't care to defend, but I don't think the evidence is there to conclude he is a misogynist with any kind of confidence. I'm interested to hear what people say about this. If you think I'm wrong, please let me know. And if you found value in this, I would greatly appreciate you hitting the like or even the subscribe button. Thank you, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.